I have a question about the SAVE Act. Really want to talk differing points of views. Like Kevin, I don't know exactly where you stand on it, but I'd love to hear your perspective from the Democrat side. What is going to be the real argument here besides Schumer's, Jim Crow business again, once again? But just like, what's the true like? I'm center right. What's the true argument against it? And then
You want, I'm
Larry,
sorry, but before, just to clarify, you want the argument they're going to make, or what if there's a merititious argument?
hmm,
What is it? Or both? You can have both if you want.
maybe a little bit of both, because I know
Okay.
what we're going to hear on the
All right.
media, right? I know we're going to,
Let
yeah.
Kevin answer that. Kevin, will they just continue to say Jim Crow on steroids? And is there a principled argument against requiring ID to vote?
Yeah, Chad, it's a really good.
You got to have
Yeah,
ID
yeah.
at got to have ID at Costco. So sorry, go ahead.
Well, again, that's the thing, right? And that's why Harry Ensign on CNN the other day, like 80% of Democrats support voter ID, right, at the polls. So it's an 80-20 issue, like a lot of issues where we find ourselves on the wrong side of it. You saw, Mark mentioned Chuck Schumer this morning on Morning Joe, kind of teasing some of the arguments, and there is something to be said for 11% or something, 10% of Americans don't have access to their original birth certificate. A lot of folks don't have their passport just because they don't do a lot of travel. And the question of maiden name changes and things like that, I think, are going to be the formulaic responses to this. But again, to your point, it's an 80-20 issue. I think, too, interestingly enough, and oftentimes Democrats have said, especially in the South, where I spend a lot of the time, that, rural African Americans, for example, that have just, some of them, older generations, don't necessarily have a birth certificate. Their family's been here, for 500 years, but that just is not something that they have easy access to, and it would affect them. My thinking on this potentially too is it could hurt some Republicans, because you look at what's the keyest indicator in terms of how you're going to vote, how much money you make, and your level of education. Right, as Democrats retreat more and more to more educated folks across the country, Donald Trump has been extraordinary turning out rural folks, folks without college degrees, and working class folks that oftentimes also struggle with getting an ID, out there. So I think it's an interesting, and we'll see what happens with the SAVE Act. I think this only happens if it's likely tacked onto a must-pass bill. I doubt it's going to pass on its own, because, again, it's going to have to hit that 60 vote margin in the Senate. But Chad, it's a really good question in terms of how it's all going to play out in terms of the messaging.
I guess for me, I can't imagine an 80-20, 90-10 potential issue, how you can get up there and say, I feel like you're calling a big swath of Americans idiots and dumb for not being able to get an
Yeah.
ID, or too poor and too stupid.
Sometimes
Like,
it
it just seems like a really
not dumb,
thing.
not dumb. It's just it's complicated sometimes.
Yeah.
Certainly,
And
with some of those original documents that you
I'll-
need. I mean,
Yeah.
Chad, if as anyone that's been to the DMV,
Yeah.
it's oftentimes not an easy thing. I had to get a DC driver's license and had 18 utility bills that I needed for an ID here in Washington D.C., a liberal city that's overregulated. Not to sound like Larry, but
Kevin,
that's oftentimes part of the problem.
If I may, Kevin, that's kind of the point. We all have to jump through extraordinary hoops to, get a driver's license. Shouldn't we have to jump through extraordinary hoops to vote? Because we cherish the vote so much. And to the idea that, there's a certain percentage that don't have access to this documentation to prove their citizenship. It's federal law right now that if you get a job, you have to fill out an I-9 form. The exact same documents you need for an I-9 form are the exact same documents you can use to prove that you can vote.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. If there are people who are incapable of proving that they can work in this country, how about Republicans and Democrats work together, do an initiative bipartisan to make sure that those Americans who do slip through the cracks get that documentation so they can actually be functioning members of our society.
Yeah.
And I'll just say,
Agree
take
completely.
it back to the media. When President Biden talked about Jim Crow on steroids and the Georgia law, when the ability to vote in Georgia is easier, even after the Republican changes, than in Delaware and New York, the press lost all credibility because they didn't call Biden out on it. Okay, so on these issues, there's an opportunity. Washington Post, meet me at camera 2, cover this. Okay, Larry says that this is the complaints are much ado about nothing. that there's ways to vote if you take your responsibility seriously. Let's find out. When Chuck Schumer says a woman changes her name and she doesn't have an ID, let's find out. Is that a real thing? Seems like that might be a real thing. I hadn't heard that since this morning. But I've not read a single article ever in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Politico. Maybe I've missed them. I apologize if I did, but I've not read one, and I'm interested in the topic that says what are the facts? Let the voters decide. If Chuck Schumer says if there's more sunlight on this, people will move from an 80-20 support for this to lower. Let's have the sunlight. Let's have the facts.
But Chad, to your original point in the question, and I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I'm so happy you brought it up. Democrats cannot, to Mark's point, just rest on this Jim Crow 2.0 stuff as it's problematic to begin with. Yeah. It's wrong for folks to be out there saying it because it's not true. The struggles of the 20s and 30s with blacks in the South are not anywhere what the situation is right now. So we can't rest on that marching. It's probably and I'm happy to call him out.
Chad,
I know you've heard it before, Chad, but you are indeed a Chad.
Okay.
Chad, do you have a second topic you want to do real quick?
Not a second topic, but just kind of a real quick flip side, to Larry. What's the downside of the SAVE Act, if there is any? What are the Republicans going to regret if it ever does get passed? But I hear something saying, okay, we're going to federalize the elections. I mean, do you really think that happens?
That's what is feared among some Senate Republicans right now, and that they've always sort of hung their hat on this notion that states run elections, and as soon as we open the door and put the foot in the door or camel's nose under the tent to allow the Congress to dictate things. But see, that ship's already sailed with motor voter in the 90s and other provisions that have already been sort of allowed. There are certain things that Congress does have a say in with regard to how elections are run. And this is a fundamental one. It's literally in the Constitution that only citizens can vote. So why not have a law that you have to prove you're a citizen when you register to vote? It's pretty simple.
They say that something that's easy is like a walk in the park. Well, easier than a walk in the park, hit the subscribe button, be part of the Two-Way community, never miss an episode, be part of our conversations. Thank you for your service to America.
And don't forget, you can now listen to the Morning Meeting and Two-Way Tonight on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.